Hello, this is Brett Lonsdale from Lightning Tools, and welcome to our second session today, the BCS MetaMan and TermSync webinar. Today we're going to be taking a look at business connectivity services and everything that it provides. We'll get a good overview of that. We're also going to have a look at, or a detailed look at BCS MetaMan and how to connect to some external data sources for business connectivity services. And I've also got my partner here, Jeff Kate, from Premier Point Solutions, and he's going to be demonstrating his product, which is the TermSync tool, and we can look at using that to pull in the external data from business connectivity services into your managed metadata term store. And that makes it great for uniformity with inside our SharePoint lists and libraries when we're storing metadata. Okay, so welcome to the session. We've got a few slides, lots of demos for you, so I hope you enjoy it. There will be opportunity to ask questions. I'll provide my email address and Twitter handle and so on. I'll be monitoring that through the webinar, and also if you do have questions right at the very end of the webinar, we can open it up for a live question and answer session. So if you do have any questions, you can raise your hand, I can unmute you, and feel free to ask your questions. So if you do want to do that, make sure your mic is all set up and working, and yeah, certainly you'll be able to ask questions live during the webinar. Okay, so as I mentioned, my name is Brett Lonsdale. I'm one of the co-founders of Lightning Tools. Lightning Tools is a provider of SharePoint tools, web parts and add-ins for SharePoint on-premises and also Office 365. We've got products that work with permissions management and content aggregation, also the data integration, which includes the BCS MetaMan tool, and we've also got some other things like charting tools and social and so on as well. Over here in the UK, I'm an organizer of the SharePoint Saturday. We've also got a new event as well called the UK Community Day, which runs bi-monthly. It's a free-to-attend event. We so far have held them up in Manchester in the UK and also London. We've got another one coming up in Nottingham as well. So completely free to attend. Bring your own machine, and you can work live as we go through some hands-on labs and what have you. Like I say, if you do have any questions, my Twitter handle is @BrettLonsdale. There's also the Lightning Tools Twitter handle is @Lightning Tools, so feel free to like I say, message us on those. Also, if you're a user of Facebook, then one of the things we will do later is be posting this video, recorded video, up on Facebook, and I think Jeff's also going to be posting it up on YouTube as well, so you'll be able to watch it back at your leisure. Also. Okay, so just before we move across to Jeff, just explain a little bit of my background with business connectivity services. So back in with SharePoint 2003, one of the things I was kind of impressed about with SharePoint was the data viewer, or data view web part back then, which was part of Microsoft Front Page, for those of you who remember it, and it didn't matter whether you used the Windows SharePoint services or whether you used SharePoint Portal Server, as it was called back then. You could display external data on a web part page using the data view web part, which is really powerful, and you could apply some conditional formatting, have some joins between those web parts for one-to-many relationships, and so on as well. And that was great. And SharePoint 2007 came along, and I was even more amazed with the business data catalog. So BDC was launched, and it provided us not just web parts, but also the ability to integrate external data with search, to be able to look up some of that external data using an external data column, and you also had some Office integration as well with Outlook and so on. So the business data catalog was there. The only thing that was difficult was to create a connection to these external data sources. Back then you had to create what was known as an application definition file, and that was a great big long XML file that typically you had to write by hand. There was a few examples from Microsoft, but nothing more than that. So we developed a tool called BDC MetaMan, which is nearing 10 years old, and is now known as BCS MetaMan, and that basically builds the connections and the the external content type, as it's now called, for you, so you're not having to write this XML by hand. That said, in 2010, the Business Connectivity Services was launched, and that was basically a renamed Business Data Catalog. Apart from, rather than it just being read-only, it allowed you to write back to the external data as well using an external list. So you could create an external list, create items, edit items, delete items, and so on, as well as use the web parts and the search integration and everything else that you had already with the Business Data Catalog. So I was so much a fan, I wrote the first book, the Business Data Catalog. At the end of that, decided I'm never ever going to write a book again. But that's a little bit like getting drunk. If you get drunk, you get a hangover, and somebody offers you a drink, and you say, no, I'm not drinking ever again, until the next day when somebody says, hey, would you like a drink? And you think that that's a wonderful idea. So so that happened with the book. So I swore not to write one, and then a year later decided to write the 2010 version. But I've learnt my lesson now. There is no 2013 version. Okay, so that's a little bit about my my background there. I'm going to hand over to Jeff, who will explain a little bit about his background. So here we are, Jeff.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Brett, and welcome everyone. Looking forward to telling you about the BCS and MetaMan and TermSync, and I'm the president and founder of Premier Point Solutions, formerly SharePoint Solutions. We've been in the SharePoint world since 2003, so about 13 years now, and started out in the training side of the market, but then shortly added a division to create add-ons for SharePoint. We've been doing that for 10 or 12 years now, and the one we're going to talk about today is a newer one. It's been on the market for about 3 years, called Managed Metadata Term Store Sync, and sort of came out of, one of the things that came out of was I had written a course called Designing Enterprise Content Management Systems with SharePoint, and a big part of that course is using the Managed Metadata feature set. And so we saw a gap when we were starting to train people on it. So that was part of the initiative for developing the add-on. And if you want to contact me, I'm available at Jeff Kate on Twitter, and looking forward to the session. Thanks, Brett.
Okay, thank you, Jeff, too. All right, excellent. So what are we going to cover? Well, first of all, we're just going to have a high-level introduction to business connectivity services. This is to make sure that everybody's on the same page as to what business connectivity services provides you. And then we're going to take a look at some of the business problems that business connectivity services resolves. Why would we use it? Who's involved in configuring the whole thing? We've got a wide variety of different roles that would be involved there, from SharePoint administrators through to DBAs, as well as end users and information, well, I guess power users as well. So we'll have a look at who's involved in configuring it, and then we're going to take a look at business connectivity services out of the box. So if you don't sorry, if you're using business connectivity services, whether it's SharePoint Foundations or the enterprise version, we'll have a look and get a good understanding of what you get right out of the box there. So that includes the external list. So I mentioned that it was introduced with SharePoint 2010. You do get the external list with all the versions of SharePoint, so even from SharePoint Foundations, and that allows you to look at external data with inside a list as though it is with inside SharePoint. So from your end user's point of view, you could have a customer relationship management tool or an Oracle database, whatever it might be, in the back end, and your end users will be able to access that information. They'll be able to read it, they'll be able to write back to it, and they'll be able to delete items and so on, assuming you give them permissions to do so, that they can write back to the external data also. There's also a number of different web parts. So there's the business data list web part, the related list web part, business data item web part, and so on. These web parts you can add to any web part page any team site. You can build dashboard pages, and they allow you to view the data, and you can pick and choose which columns you want to see, any sort orders, anything like that you can apply, and also filters, etc., can be put in place. The great thing about that is you can build a really powerful dashboard right out of the box. It might require some XSLT skills, but again, you can achieve it, which is the main thing. Business data column, or the external data column, lives within inside SharePoint lists and libraries. That can be used to look up metadata from the external data source. And Jeff's product, the TermSync, builds on this even further. But if we take an external data column, well, let's just say we've got a document library and somebody's creating a quotation for a customer or an invoice for a customer. One easy way to find it is if you actually store the name of the customer along with that document as metadata. Now, if we just had that as a single line of text column, users are going to simply just use abbreviations, they'll use typos and so on, and you're not going to get any consistency with that data. So that'll make it difficult to search, it'll make it difficult to filter by as well. So you could use the external data column, and that allows you to, rather than key in the data, you can look it up from the external data source. It provides a picker, and then you basically, from that dialog box from the picker, you basically select an item, and it stores that data as metadata. So that's great. The term store is one step further, and I'll let Jeff talk about that a little bit later on. We've also got the Office client. So if you use Office, then obviously you'll be familiar with Word, Excel, PowerPoint, etc. And Business Connectivity Services hooks into Outlook, so you can take external data. It might be customers, or it could be timesheets or anything like that, stored inside an external data source, and you can bring it into Outlook. You can bring it into your calendar in Outlook. You can bring data into your contacts in Outlook as tasks and so on. It's basically a case of specifying the data type when you pull it in. And there's also search. So if we want to, like I say, search on external data, you can. This provides us with a one-stop shop for searching for all business information. If you take Google as a great example, you go onto Google, you see a white page, and it's got a box in the middle, and you can search on literally anything. Users like that, and we can provide them that within SharePoint. We can provide them with the search site, so not only are they searching list items and documents and content, but they can also search external data via the same search box. Yeah, we could search for customers or any information like that. So we're going to have a look at how we create these external content types. I'll discuss the out-of-the-box tools like Visual Studio and SharePoint Designer, but we're going to be taking a look at BCS MetaMan today, and yeah, we'll talk about why that exists as a product and how we can use it to create the external content type that's required by Business Connectivity Services. And then we're going to wrap up today with Jeff talking about the TermSync tool and how we can bring that data in as managed metadata into our term store. Okay, so hopefully that's whet your appetite. Let's take a look first of all at the business problems resolved. And it doesn't really matter what organization you're in, what the size of your organization is. When we design business processes within inside a department of our organizations, we're going to choose the software, or we're going to develop the software that will basically run those business processes for a particular part of the organization. So if it's sales, then we'll have a customer relationship management tool. We'll choose the best tool that we can for that. Likewise for warehousing and accounting and so on. So we might have Dynamic CRM, we may have SAP, we might have Sage, we could have some Excel documents, some Access databases. Whatever it is, we're going to have some different systems running that provide the logic, if you like, for those departments and the business processes that they go through. The problem with that is quite often, because there isn't really one tool that will run our entire organization, we end up with different silos of data that are not connected in any way. So that means we have to do cross-training from people within inside different departments, maybe importing and exporting of data, and a lot of mashing up of data as well to get the information that we want. So just a simple example would be, we've got a list of customers in CRM, but how many of those have outstanding invoices? Maybe we need to do a bit of a mashup between Dynamics CRM and Sage in order to get that information. So with SharePoint, we can utilize SharePoint. If you're on this call, you've probably already got SharePoint. We can utilize SharePoint and make it the central hub for information. So we use the search, we use the dashboards and so on, and from it we can look at all of this data from anywhere inside of our organizations, from any department. We need to train people how to use SharePoint. If we've got somebody that doesn't necessarily be in or need to be inside Dynamics CRM, then yeah, they could go and view a list of customers in SharePoint without even knowing that it comes from the Dynamics CRM tool. Okay, so what makes all of this happen? Well, we've got a high-level diagram of business connectivity services here. Right at the very top, we're separating what goes on with the SharePoint server versus the Office client. And from the SharePoint server point of view, there's the web parts that we talked about, the search, the external data column. There's also an object model as well. So if you wanted to build your own custom solution around business connectivity services, you could do so. You can do that very quickly indeed. You're not having to reinvent the wheel by writing lots of code to go at data and convert data types and so on. That's done for you inside the BCS object model. All you need to do is just write a few codes of getting that, a few lines of code of getting that data, and then you can call methods such as the finder method and so on to get at that data and apply filters, and all this logic is already built for you. There's also a user profile that, well, every SharePoint user has a user profile, and the better populated that is, the better the audience targeting for content in SharePoint, and the better the people searches as well. So what we can do is maybe look at pulling in data from PeopleSoft or a human resources tool where we've got people's skills, who they report to, that sort of thing. That kind of information, we can pull that into SharePoint via BCS as well, and that would only improve the targeting of content and the people searches. So all of that is available in SharePoint Server. Like I mentioned already, you can pull data into Outlook, into Excel. You can build forms and reports and things in Access on external data. And then we've also got Visio. You can build gauges. Word, you can use quick parts to look up from data, as well as with InfoPath, you can look up from business connectivity services using some controls within inside an InfoPath form. So there's lots of integration that business connectivity services provides. So the middle section of this diagram with the blue shaded area, this is basically how business connectivity services works. So we've got a BCS runtime or BDC runtime. That BDC runtime provides us with all the authentication and everything that takes place, and calling the right method in order to get at the data. There's a server-side runtime as well as a client-side runtime. So when you install Microsoft Office, if we were using Excel to maintain its own connection to BCS, then that would use the client-side BDC runtime in order to communicate with the external data. There's different ways of authenticating. You can, if we take something like Microsoft SQL, you could authenticate using mixed mode or Windows authentication. Mixed mode, we basically send across a username and password. If we were using Windows Auth, then users are going to be authenticated via a token. We have the option also of using the secure store as well, so single sign-on, and that allows us to not only get over double hop issues and so on that we might experience, but also authenticate against dissimilar systems. So for example, we could authenticate via salesforce.com or something like that in the cloud, something that is completely unaware of our Active Directory users and so on. We can map credentials using the secure store. So I would map maybe AD groups or individual users to a specific account that works with salesforce.com, something to that effect. So there's multiple ways of authenticating. You can apply authorization as well. So we can set each SharePoint user can be given different privileges on these external content types. So can they actually configure the external content type? Can they configure the web parts that access the data? Can they view the data inside the web parts and so on? These are all things that you can configure for each and every SharePoint user. So security isn't a concern when you're connecting to external data via BCS. The external content type is the thing that we're going to build using BCS MetaMan. And basically that external content type describes the data that we're connecting to. So every single column is strongly typed. We have methods as well that we'll discuss shortly. So the different methods will call the data from the external data source either to read or to read a specific item, or also allow us to create, update and delete items as well if we want to via the external list. So once we create this external content type, it can be developed by hand in XML. You can create it as a DLL or a web service. Either way, once SharePoint is aware of it, it's basically going to write all of the connection information and the methods to a central database called the metadata store. Not to be confused with managed metadata. The metadata store basically stores the configurations purely for business connectivity services. Okay, so there's a number of different connectors as well. One of them that's new to 2013 and Office 365 is OData. So we can use OData to connect maybe from on-premises external data sources to the cloud. So you could use BCS MetaMan with Office 365, connect to an OData source that is exposing data via SQL or Oracle on-prem. And you could do it vice versa as well, so you can get data from the cloud and display it with inside SharePoint on premises. We've got a SQL connector, there's a WCF web service, and also a .NET assembly, which is a DLL that you'll have created the code for in order to access the data. So they're the four out-of-the-box connectors, although you can also create a custom connector, so you could build your own custom connector for things like Salesforce and so on. And that's exactly what we've done with BCS MetaMan. There's over 30 data sources that you can connect to without having to write any code. Okay, so hopefully that sort of gives you an idea as to what BCS is, but we're going to look in a little bit more detail in a moment as to what each of these features do. First of all, who's involved in configuring it? Well, these are the four different roles, and you might be working for a smaller organization where you are the person that does all of these roles, but typically we need some good communication among people. So the first one is the SharePoint admin. So the SharePoint admin, whoever's got access to SharePoint Central Administration, needs to first of all configure the Business Connectivity Services application and proxy. That allows us to use Business Connectivity Services. It starts the BDC runtime and so on. So we need that to be in place. They'll also be configuring security. So they'll be setting up the secure store. They'll also be applying permissions to each external content type and which of the SharePoint users will be able to access that data. And then finally, they'll also be configuring search. So they need to know what external data sources to index, when those indexes are going to run, and so on. All of that would need to be configured by the SharePoint admin, or at least in SharePoint Central Administration. The DBA, the database administrator, is somebody that you really need on your side because unless you have at least read access to the data with a logon, you're not going to access it. That data needs to be made available. It needs to provide you with credentials that you can log in as and access the data. Obviously, if you want to use something like the external list to also write back to the external data source, then you need to have more than just read access, because that account is also going to be writing back to the data store as well. And it's you can help out the database administrators or win them over by looking at using Secure Store, so that you're not just having one SQL login access the database and therefore they can't audit who's been viewing the data. If at least they have a good idea as to who's accessing the data, they might be more inclined to let you have the access to it. There's also the SharePoint developers, so they will be creating the external content types. Whether they use Visual Studio, SharePoint Designer, or a third-party tool, they'll be creating that. So they need to be armed with the information about where the database resides, how to log into it, what tables, views, or stored procedures, etc. to access. And then finally, we've got the information worker, so the person that's going to be providing the external lists, configuring the web parts. Perhaps maybe a project worker that's going to be building the solution within SharePoint. So once we've got all of that in place, you'll be able to use business connectivity services. And one thing we're going to start off looking at is the external list. So as I mentioned, this is the external list looks and behaves just like an ordinary SharePoint list. If you've created a contacts list or a task list or something like that, you've created items in there, this acts in the same way. You can create new items, you can view, edit and delete items. We just need to make those methods available. Now those methods directly correlate with the external content type. If we want something to be read-only, then we just create what's known as a finder method. We'd need to have a specific finder as well. So the finder method, if we look at the screenshot on here, basically returns all of the rows and all of the columns, and you can have filters on the back of finder methods. Where it says products read list, that directly relates to a finder method. I could have German customers, French customers, US customers, UK customers, and so on as different finder methods already created inside my external content type. So whenever anybody goes and creates an external list, they will have these views already instantiated for them. Likewise with the web parts, you can add a BDC web part onto the page and you can select which view you want to show, and that would correlate to the finder method. So it's the finder method that displays all the data. If we hit the drop down and choose view item, we're calling what's known as the specific finder, and the specific finder is basically passing through the unique identifier of that table to another method to open it up, so it will only get one row of data and return it to the user. They're the two required ones. You've got to have those two methods for the external list to work. The others, we've got the ability to create a new item, so that's a creator method. We've got the edit item, which is an updater method, and we've got the delete item with a deleter method. So if you want to have all of that functionality, then you just need to create those methods when you're building your external content type. Within the external list, you'll notice that you can build views, you can apply filters, you can do sorting, you can customize the forms, you can export to Excel and so on. There are a few things that you can't do, and we'll take a look at that right now. Things that you might be used to doing inside something like a task list is building multiple edit views, applying personal permission, item permissions, and RSS feeds and so on. All of those things are unavailable. So if we go to this customers external list, you'll notice we've got the data here, and if we go to the list ribbon, these are all the things we can do. So we can create views. Notice you can't create additional columns. There is no RSS feed, but we can go through and set list settings and, like I say, create other views and do filters and that sort of thing as well. Other than that, it behaves like an ordinary list. The surprising thing is the data doesn't actually reside here in the list, and that's a good thing. There are third-party tools that allow you to import data into a SharePoint list. But what we're doing there is taking potentially tens of thousands of items and duplicating it. We're going to end up with two copies, one inside our SharePoint SQL database and the other one inside whichever data source it came from in the first place. And that will provide issues with syncing, record locking problems, and so on. So the good thing about business connectivity services, apart from being out of the box with SharePoint, is it allows you to update that data, and it would write back directly to the data source. SharePoint is just simply displaying the data inside the list here. Okay, so you'll notice in the drop down there that we also get the different methods, so whether it's view item or view and edit and so on. That's easy to create by just specifying the type of method that we want to display. Creating external lists is also straightforward. So the name of Business Data Catalog that was given to BCS back in SharePoint 2007 was very descriptive. You're basically creating a catalog of information that users can add. So by going to add an app, we can select the external list, and we've got the picker here where we can just simply go through and select from a category of information. So notice we've got products, we've got finished goods, we've got customers, vendors, and so on that we can select. So if we take products as an example, I can choose that and just call this Brett Products and click Create. So the end user is not having to do any real configuration. That's all been done for them by the developer who created the external content type and the administrator who deployed it to the SharePoint environment. Okay, so yeah, there's our Brett's product, so we can go into that and simply access this information. The one responsibility I would say the developer has is some of these tables have very obscure names inside the underlying database, but what you get to do when you create the external content type is use some friendly names, so that it is just things like products and customers, vendors, and so on in the SharePoint UI, and very descriptive as to what that data does. Okay, so there's also some web parts. The web parts are read-only. You can add them to any web part page, and you also have the ability to do web part connections. So we've got, for example, the business data read list, business data list web part, and the business data related list web part. So from any SharePoint page, we can go in and edit that page. And with inside the web part zones, we can go in, choose Insert, select web part, and under business data, you'll notice a lot of the business data web parts. So we've got the business data list web part, the related list web part. There's also business data item that will show one row at a time in a column format. And then we've also got things like actions and connectivity filters and things like that that we can add to the page. So if we choose the business data list web part, we can just simply drop that onto the page here. And by clicking onto the Open the Tool pane link, we can choose the type of data. So that's the external content type. Once again, it's just a case of choosing the one that we want to work with. So I'll choose customers, click on OK. Here's your view as the drop down, so that's going to be the finder method that you're selecting, and you've also got things like an XSL editor if you wanted to go and apply conditional formatting or anything like that. But if we hit apply, that will obtain the data and all the columns and so on, and we could go in and edit the view with inside that web part. So we can select which columns we want to show. We can apply filters, pagination, that kind of thing as well. Notice there are also two filter sections. One at the very top there, which is all grayed out. So that allows the user to provide a filter value, or this one here where it's not grayed out and people can just simply go through and select the column and set the value. The difference is this filter is doing it after the data has been fetched from the external data source. However, at the top there, we would need to create the filters on the finder method, expose the columns we want the users to be able to filter by, and then they'll be able to use those before the data is fetched. So they'll be able to say the customer is equal to Germany, the country is equal to Germany, or something to that effect. Okay, so once we're happy with that, we just hit OK, and then we'll have the web part configured on our page. If we'd have hit save, that's the only thing that you must do. So let's just drop that on again. So we'll hit insert web part. We'll wiggle the mouse, which will make the machine go faster. There we go. So under business data, we'll take the business data list, add that once more, and we'll choose customers, and we'll hit apply. Okay, and this time I'll hit that save and close button, which is why the web part disappeared. So we must hit save and close. Okay. Not having much fun with this today. Here we are. Let's just try one more time. There we go. So we've now got customers on the page, and we can go and add the business data item just to display one item, and so on and so forth. There's also custom actions that we can provide, and the custom actions are a very powerful way of getting the data to do something else. What we can do as an example is do a Google search. So if we had a list of customers, we might want to Google the customer name. If we had a list of products, we might want to Google the product name, or maybe we've got the email address for a customer, we might want to email them. All of these things can usually be done via a URL. So we can take the google.com URL with a query parameter at the end of it and pass through one of the columns as the replacement for that parameter. So notice in the screenshot here there's a placeholder for the ID, so that ID could simply be the company name or something like that, and that would then provide a drop down inside the external list to Google that customer. Okay, so very effective. And then we've also got the business data item external data lookup, and what this allows us to do, as I mentioned, is look up against the external data source to store some metadata. So if we jump into SharePoint once more, and we could go through and create a quick document library. So we'll hit add an app, and we'll just take a regular document library here, and I'll call it docs. Okay, and within docs we can from the library create a new column, and we're after this one here, the external data. So we could call that customer, select the external content type that we're interested in, and then we can also choose one of the columns like the customer name, and that will allow us to store that value and display some other information as well. So once we've done that, we can upload a document, we can create a new document, and that document will basically be will basically have that metadata set. So if we just take a simple document here, okay, so now we can look up the customer. Now we can choose the customer. Notice you have got this dialog box in order to select from the customer. One of the issues with that is it will only display 200 rows, so you have to build in these filters. There's no type ahead or anything, and that's one of the things that the term sync helps resolve. But this is useful. We can also go through and search on this data now, which we wouldn't be able to do before. So there's also the Office client integration. So if we wanted to take an external list, we could take that data into Excel. This is a snippet from a Word document. We could create a Word document template, put some quick parts into it. Those quick parts are basically going to map through to the business data columns in the document library, and that means that users can maybe generate a new letter to a customer, select the customer actually within the document, and that will populate all of the other columns, as well as write that information back to the columns actually inside the document library. So some great integration there with Word. You've got pretty much the same functionality in InfoPath, and like I say, in Visio you can even create gauges based on your data as well. Okay, and then there's also the search. So the search is configured from within inside Central Admin, you basically build a search scope that points to an external data source. That external data source will get indexed, and then you'll be able to search from the search center your external data as well as your internal data. Basically, we provide something called a profile page. So for each external content type, you can build a profile page, and that page is used to display the results. So if we click onto Alfred's Footerkist here, that would show us all of the details for that customer on the view profile page, and it could also be configured to show any related data as well. Okay, so as you're going to see in a moment, once I've created the external content type, that's imported into the service application. So we'll be able to see the external content types in there. Notice also in the drop-down, that's where we can create the profile page. We can also set permissions on that external content type, add custom actions and things like that as well. But first we need to build the external content type. So you can do that with SharePoint Designer. So SharePoint Designer in 2010 or also 2013, it will also work with Office 365 as well. So you can go through, add a new external content type and build your connection. It will allow you to create a connection to Microsoft SQL or a WCF service or a .NET Assembly. The WCF service and the .NET Assembly of course have to be developed. They have to be coded, although you can create a connection to SQL without having to write any code. If you want to connect to anything else, be it Salesforce, Dynamics CRM, or Access or something like that, you need to go into Visual Studio. And using Visual Studio, you can create your external content type in there, but you'd need to write the code. And then for a lot less than Visual Studio, you can buy a third-party tool like BCS MetaMan, and using BCS MetaMan, you don't have to write any code at all, and you can create connections over 30 different data sources, as I mentioned. So that's what we're going to take a look at. We'll take a look at BCS MetaMan now, and then I'll hand over to Jeff to take a look at the term store. So in BCS MetaMan, you'll notice on the left-hand side here we've got some different data sources. So we've got the likes of Microsoft Dynamics CRM online. We've also got OData, so we can provide a URL to an OData source. We can connect to lots of different ODBC data sources, so it's MySQL or DB2, Sybase, etc., etc. There's lots in there. You can also choose other data source, and as long as you've got the ODBC driver installed, you can connect to it. You can connect to Oracle just simply by specifying the server name, the username and password, and optionally using the secure store. We can connect to salesforce.com. We can also connect to a WCF service, and what I'm going to do is demonstrate a connection to Microsoft SQL. Okay, so using any of these, we basically fill in the fields. So we've got the name of the server, the type of authentication that we want to use, and the name of the database. So the database we can just simply select from the drop-down, and then you can also use Secure Store if you want to handle your authentication, which we're doing in this case. So when I hit the blue arrow, that will create our connection, and it will return all of the different tables, views, and stored procedures from that database. And simply all we need to do is select the ones that we want to work with. So what I'm going to do here is come down to the product subcategory. So we can drag the product subcategory onto the page. And we've got on the right hand side here the methods that we want to create. So remember, these methods correlate with the things that you can do with inside SharePoint. So we've got the finder method and the specific finder method. Those two are required by the external list, but just those two alone are only going to provide you with read-only access to the data. So the finder method, that's basically your view of data, returning the rows and the columns. They can have filters on them as well. And then we've also got the specific finder method, and that's the one that will open up an item, whether it's from a search result that you're opening up that item, whether it's from within inside a web part that you're opening up that item. So basically that's the specific finder. The next one down is the ID enumerator. And the ID enumerator is used for the search indexing. So if you want to be able to index this data, then you would provide an ID enumerator method. And then we've also got the creator, updater, and deleter that speak for themselves. We've also got the primary key set. So it selected that by default for me. It recognized that there was only one column in that table that had a unique identifier. So all we need to do is hit create, and that puts that entity on the page for us. Now, in order to determine whether we've got the right data, we can just hit the icon in the top right hand corner, and it will return the first 10 rows from that table, so we can see what data is coming back. If we want to build an association, so this would allow us to have a one-to-many join represented in a business data list and related list web part, then we could simply go through and drag another table like product, drop that onto the design surface here. Again, select the methods that we want to work with, hit create, and we've now got that on our design surface as well. We can build a join, so we drag and drop the join between the two and set the primary key and the foreign key, so it knows how to work with those two tables. And once we hit create, that's it, the join's created. Now, even if we searched using the SharePoint search on a category, like maybe wheels, it would return not just wheels as the category, but it would also return the related data if we'd have done this as well. So we'll see all of the wheel types that we've got stored inside our products table. Each of these we can also go through and configure further. So under product, one of the things I might want to do is set a title column. This is something you can set in SharePoint anyway, but setting it here saves us the bother. The office item type allows us to control how this data would be exported into Outlook, so whether it's a contact or an appointment, etc. And then we've also got each of the columns that are going to be returned. They're all strongly typed, and for each one there's also properties that you can set as well, such as the show in picker and things like that. Under methods, this is where we can add more methods if we want to, so we just simply click on to add. But on our finder method there, we can go through and change the name of it, or we can also go through and add some filters. One filter that is recommended is to create a limit filter. If you don't create a limit filter, SharePoint will tell you that you didn't create a limit filter, but it continues to work. All it basically means is by default, each finder method can only return 2,000 rows. So for that reason, you might want to, rather than see an error message, actually set the limit filter here. So I can choose the product ID and maybe set the default value to 1,000. One way of overachieving 2,000 items per external list is to create lots of different finder methods. One that might return German customers, one that might return UK customers, etc., or even do it by town or by category, whatever it might be, and that way you can over exceed the amount of data. You can also change that threshold using PowerShell to 5,000 items as well. So that's creating the method. We can click on to update, and finally, if we just go back to configure entity, under actions is where we can create a custom action. So this is where I could choose something like the Google search, and rather than allow people to Google search a product ID, which wouldn't be very interesting, they could Google search the name of a product. So that name of the product would be passed through to this query URL. Okay, so that's how we can build an external content type, and this would essentially generate 300 or 400 lines of code. So notice here, if we just browse to the desktop, and we'll hit save, and let's just generate that. Okay, so that's created my AdventureWorks.products file. And so what we've Let's open that up with Notepad. Okay, so that's basically what's been generated using BCS MetaMan is all of this configuration with inside an XML file that we're going to import into SharePoint. Okay, so it's a huge time saver. What we'll do just to make Jeff's life easy, I'm just going to go with a single entity here called product. All he requires is not the ability to write back. In fact, let's get rid of that one again and add it one more time. So he just wants a read-only view that he can work with the term sync. So here we will grab production.product, and to make it read-only, we're just going to have those two methods. Let's hit create, and we'll set a limit filter in place. So that it only returns the 1000 rows. Okay, and we'll hit update, and then we're going to deploy. Okay, so yes, we want to overwrite it, and that's going to basically deploy this external content type out to SharePoint, and we'll test it, and we'll then hand over to Jeff to carry on with the term sync. So that's currently deploying. It has deployed, so now we can jump into our SharePoint environment. Let's go through add an app. We'll select the external list, and from the data source configuration, we're looking at this one here that we just created using MetaMan. So MetaMan.product. Okay, I think that's thinking about creating it. There we go. And there we go. We've got the data again coming through to our SharePoint environment. The external content type would be available through central administration. Okay, so at that point, I'm going to hand over to Jeff. He'll talk to you about the managed metadata service. So Jeff, over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Brett. First, I might ask you, did you give me mouse and keyboard control? I'll need that. Oh, I think you made me the presenter where you were just supposed to give me mouse and keyboard. Let's see you there, Brett. I think you might be muted.
Could you make me presenter again?
Yes.
I apologize.
Yes, I will. Yeah.
And then I'll be able to give you control.
All right.
We're good at BCS and SharePoint, but not GoToMeeting software.
Right. Yeah, right. All right. Now you're a presenter.
Okay, great. And I can give you a keyboard and mouse. There we go. We're good.
All right, great. Well, thank you very much for giving us that tour, Brad. I mean, it's amazing to me how rich the feature set is in business connectivity services, and you know how big of a difference it can make for businesses. if you go ahead and leverage those features. But typically, those aren't the first features that you leverage in SharePoint when you first get going on it. More of a next step or advanced type set of features. But boy, you need to get there if you haven't already gotten there, because it's impressive what you can do. And with BCS MetaMan, that really opens the door in terms of flexibility of the data sources that you can choose from, as opposed to SharePoint Designer, and it also sure makes it a heck of a lot easier and faster to get things up and going. So let's see, I think maybe I need to go back one slide here. Let's see if I am. I'm not getting any keyboard and mouse control at this point. There we go. Sorry for the delay there. Okay, yeah, I'm at the right spot. All right, so you know, the Managed Metadata Service is another feature of SharePoint that was introduced in SharePoint 2010. So if you happen to still be on SharePoint 2007 or before, you don't have this available to you, because it was not introduced until 2010, and of course it's in 2013 and available in the new 2016 that's coming out as well. And it does require the paid version of SharePoint, so you have to be on SharePoint Server Standard or SharePoint Server Enterprise. And you know, it was designed to solve the problem of the previous approaches to capturing metadata on SharePoint document libraries and lists was restricted to typically choice columns or lookup columns, or as Brett showed earlier, the external data column. And with those three, even with those three, two of the three you could add to choice and lookup columns. You could add to content types. External data columns you can't add to content types. And so there was a number of problems with SharePoint metadata related to being siloed in certain places, because content types, and for that matter site columns, are scoped at the site collection level. So if I establish a piece of metadata on one site collection, regardless of the approach that I use there, whether I use a one-off column on a list or a document library, or even if I use content type so that I can reuse that content type in multiple libraries and lists, it's still the maximum scope for that is the site collection. So as soon as the organization gets into needing multiple site collections, which is typically not very long before that happens, then the problem in 2007 and before is that you had to duplicate your metadata values in each site collection if you wanted consistency, and of course that's not a great system. So Microsoft came out with the Managed Metadata Service application in SharePoint 2010 with the goal of providing a centralized database, and that database is called the term store, that all metadata values for an organization can be stored in, and you have the option, if you use that, to sort of establish a company-wide vocabulary. So in other words, for any given metadata value that you would want to use somewhere, anywhere in SharePoint, regardless of the site collection or web application, or even in another SharePoint farm, if you're a multi-farm organization, you're able to do that with the Managed Metadata Service application in the term store because it sits at the farm level instead of at one of these other levels like a site collection or a web application level. And so therefore, for a given metadata value, you can have it one place, one value, and everybody, no matter where they are in SharePoint, can connect and use that one authorized value of that term. So a big boon in the enterprise content management world, solved a major problem in SharePoint, and very slick the way the whole thing is implemented. And they really invested, Microsoft invested a lot in it to make it a very rich design. One of the things is that it supports multiple languages, so every metadata value that you save, if you have a multilingual SharePoint deployment, you can create that value in the different languages that you need to create it in. And as far as scalability goes, they designed it to be able to support up to 1 million terms per term store. And goodness gracious, if anybody needs more than 1 million terms in their organization, they've probably got lots of problems, and the limitation on the metadata terms is probably one of the least of their problems in the organization. So can support thousands of term sets. So it was really designed to be something that organizations of any size could use, no matter how small, no matter how large. And the idea is that once you can populate the term store through the term store management tool, which is what we were looking at in that previous slide, and you can do that manually by clicking on the button, creating a term set and adding term values. It also supports hierarchical term values. Here you can see in this screenshot over to the left, the little navigation pane is showing an example of a hierarchical term set. So a classic example would be, we have a product category, a product subcategory, and a product name, and so that might be, bikes is the category, the subcategory is road bikes, and then the name is, 14-inch red road bike or whatever. So it supports that kind of hierarchy, which again, that was something that neither of the previous metadata solutions in SharePoint supported. They were all flat, no hierarchical representation. They also baked in a type ahead support. So if you look at the little snippet in the screenshot there up to the top right in the background, it shows product column in a SharePoint library, and the user is typing, and you can see below that, that there's a type ahead capability there. It's suggesting terms. It's immediately querying against the term set and suggesting terms that match. And it can even use synonyms, so the user can be typing in that product box there. If we set up a synonym of product number, perhaps the user wants to use a number, they start typing a number, but that's not how we want to tag. That's not how our enterprise content managers have decided you want to tag documents and list items with metadata values. Instead, they want to use the actual product name. Well, the user can type the synonym, such as a number, and it will suggest the right name for the user to use. And so it's kind of like a herding of cats thing. We can push our users or point them in the right direction there. And then, of course, just the it's optimized for high volume. If we had 1 million terms in the term store, we would still be able to use that type of head feature, for instance, and just get instantaneous results. So it's really optimized for a high volume of values, and it's available to use as a column type in content types, which again, that was one of the biggest restrictions on the external data column type that Brett showed, was that you can't add that. That's not available in content types. So all in all, Microsoft, the other thing you see here on this screenshot is a picture of Word, and you see the picker being brought up, and that's the type ahead and the manage metadata picker works directly inside of Word and the other Office client tools to allow the user to go ahead in the what's called the information panel at the top. The tip, I think is what it's called, is where you can expose the metadata columns, and those same controls are available directly within the Word interface and Excel and so forth. So so a rich user experience from implementing the Manage Metadata Service application and starting to use the Manage Metadata column type on your content types, libraries, and lists. But what's missing is the ability to populate that term store in a recurring way, so that from an external data source. You know, many people have discovered, boy, this is nice, and I'd really like to get my customer names in the term store, my vendor names, my product names. You know, there's lots, and in the industries there are all kinds of specific industry-related metadata values, and these things are typically maintained in the external system. You know, like the example Brett was showing, they're maintained in perhaps a ERP system, a products table, and they can certainly be exposed efficiently into SharePoint through the BCS with BCS MetaMan, but that's where it stops. It does not. SharePoint doesn't provide an out-of-the-box way to synchronize through the BCS with the term store. So that's what TermSync does, and I think I'm at the point where I can go ahead and start demoing that. So here we are back in SharePoint, and first thing let's do is let's go look at the term store management tool. And I'll just do a quick refresh there to get the current state of affairs there. And we've already done the demo once today, so we've already got products out there one time that we did previously, so I'm going to go ahead and do it a second time. I'll just create a new term set here. So I'm going to come in and say new term set, and we'll call this products 2. And you know, if we were trying to do this manually, we would click on the drop down and we would say create term, and then you know, we would create either a hierarchy or a flat group of terms that had all our product names in it. But of course we've got thousands of product names. That's a big problem. And also what happens with maintenance of the products names, that the product master lives probably outside of SharePoint in an ERP system, and there's business processes already built around the establishing of new product master records and the maintenance to those records and so forth. So it's not really feasible to manually maintain that as well here in SharePoint. So TermSync can solve that problem by creating what's referred to as a synchronization point between this term set, target term set, and a BCS application definition like the one that Brett created just a few minutes ago. And the way that's done is TermSync installs, and it's primarily a tool that a SharePoint farm administrator would set up. There would be a small amount of configuration on the front end, and then it's also kind of one of those set it and forget it types of tools. So it has a job to do. It's to synchronize external data with the term store based on the parameters that you give it for that synchronization. And once you've set those parameters, often you never change them again unless something perhaps changed in your source data or something, a schema change or something, but otherwise you just let TermSync do its job, and it works on a timer job basis, so that once you set the configuration up, a timer job will be provisioned in your SharePoint farm, and it will run on whatever schedule you give it, and do the synchronization on that schedule over and over and over again. And it's smart about how it does it, and does it in an efficient way, so that after the first synchronization, it's only pulling over pulling over changes. So let's see how we would go about setting up the initial configuration, and then we'll do an initial synchronization with it. So what we get here is a pretty simple wizard. On the left, we're seeing a view into our term store, and I'm going to select this new empty term set that I just created, products 2, and start by saying sync here. And the very first thing it asks is, tell me your business connectivity services external content type that you want to use to do the synchronization with. So perfect reason for Brett to do his part of this presentation before me, because TermSync its input data source is always a business connectivity services external content type. And as Brett pointed out, you're able to create those external content types with BCS MetaMan and connect to virtually any type of data or web service anywhere that you want to. So we'll select OK for that and go to next. And then the finder method, I think he's provided me a get all product finder method, so we'll say yes to that. And then at this point it's saying, okay, I need a name for this synchronization point, because I want to write a record into the configuration database that where I store, you know, here's how you want the synchronization done. So we type the name in and create sync point, and it's created the record, and so we can proceed. And really this is the last step in the wizard. In some ways this is the most important step. This is a mapping operation. So we click on the map properties button, and we get a dynamic mapping dialog that's broken up into 3 sections. The first section, called the name fields mapper, is you can think of that as being the basics. There's every sync point, synchronization point has to have at least 2 values, a unique ID field mapped and a name field map. So that's the minimum. In many cases that's all you need. You just want a term value in there, and as long as it has a unique ID in the source data, you can map those 2 things and you're finished. Then the second section is something called the label mapper, and that really allows you to set up the things like synonyms that I spoke about earlier. There's up to 100 separate buckets for synonyms in the term store, so you have up to 100 options to set up synonyms. Again, I can't imagine that anybody in their right mind would do that or need that, but anyway, it's there. Same thing goes for the custom property mapper. There's another 100 buckets that would allow you to map other data from the external data source. For instance, in this case, we're going to do products, and you know, we might choose that we wanted to bring over the color of the product and store that in a custom property, and we could maybe do something with that later in SharePoint. But for this one, so we're going to start up here with the name field mapper, and the left column is for the external content type or the source data. The right column is for the term store, and so we're going to choose on the left column, product ID is the primary key field for that table, and it is a unique ID column, and so we're going to map that to ID in the term store field. And then we're going to add another mapping, and we're going to map name to name. And like I say, we can stop there. In fact, I think we probably will stop there because we're just going to do a simple one here. We could get more complex. If we had a suitable hierarchical data set, then we would have the opportunity to map a parent ID column here to parent ID in the term store. If we had a logical delete flag in our source data, typically a yes or no, this master record has been deleted, we have the option to map that to an is available for tagging column. And when that's flipped on or off in SharePoint, it affects whether the users are able to see that term value and use it. So how we handle logical deletes in the source data. Now, I'm not going to do either of those because my source data right now is not set up for those. And likewise, in Label Mapper, if we chose to do that, you know, we could, for instance, we could pick something like product number. And the reason we would do that is because we know some of our users like to type product numbers, but the actual value that we're wanting to use as a metadata value is going to be name. But we could provide product number as a synonym so that as they type that, it will suggest name. And we have up to 100 possible synonym buckets there to put that into. Now, I could do that, but the problem is that this is language specific. And in order for that to map correctly, I would need to, in my source data, to have the locale ID concatenated to the front of the product number, and I don't have that in my source data, so I'm not going to be able to do that for this demo. But I've got others that I frequently do that have that in there. Anyway, we're going to keep this simple at this point and say product ID and name, and so I'm going to save my mappings and hit finish. And now my synchronization point is created. If I don't do anything else, within the next hour, the timer job will kick off, and it will do the initial synchronization of all those product master records through the BCS into the term store. But we want to see it happen faster than that, so we're going to go look at jobs here. And if we go to job definitions, there's something called a term sync supervisor job, and that job actually has to run first, and it's scheduled to run every hour as well, but you can change it to whatever frequency you want. When that job runs, it will spawn a job for any new synchronization points that it finds. So if we go ahead and run that job now, and usually that one runs really fast in a couple of seconds, so we might not be able to catch it in here. Let's see if it's already run. Not yet, but it will soon. There it is. So it saw that we have a new synchronization point, and it created a new timer job for that sync point. The reason it does that is it allows us to, you know, perhaps synchronizing vendors versus customers versus product. Perhaps you know something about the source data, about how frequently it changes and how often you would want the job to run, or how large the data set is. Perhaps some jobs would take longer than others, and so you would want to run those on a different, less frequent schedule. But in any event, for every synchronization point, you have the option to schedule its own timer job to run whenever you want it to. So now we're going to go ahead and say run now on this. And I think there's 500 and some odd records in that product database. And I think it may take this job a couple of minutes to run or something completely. See if we can catch it running. You know what, we might have had a failure on that one because we might not have the, yeah, it failed. So this is a good thing to keep in mind is in the BCS, we can fix this real fast. Let me hit refresh here. So in the BCS, when you create your content type, Microsoft has really made sure that, you know, you can lock this down real tight if you need to. Only people with certain permissions can actually even use an external content type. And this one by default got the administrator account, which was the account we're logged in as in creating the external content type. It got permissions for that. But timer jobs in SharePoint run under the timer service account, which is typically the farm account. So the reason the job failed is that the farm account does not have permissions to read the BCS external content type. So we can fix that by adding the farm account, clicking execute is all the permissions that we need. Okay. And now let's go back to our job history and let's try to run this job again and see if it goes through this time. So let's see if we can catch it running. So there it is running. Like I said, it takes a couple of minutes for it to do the initial synchronization. So let's go ahead and flip over here and cheat and hit refresh. And let's expand this out and see if it started to populate. Yeah, products 2. And you can see there that it's started populating the different values. So now that we have that, that opens the door for us to come in and, you know, pick a document library or a list or create a new one. And here we're, and on this document library, we can come and create a new column. And we'll call it products. And this time we're going to have a manage metadata type of column. And we'll come down and it wants us to bind the column data source to the term set that we want to use for the term values for this column. So we want products 2. And we'll say OK. And now if we add a new document here, pick one of those. And so our document's been added, but it's asking for some metadata here. Actually, I already had a previous manage metadata column bound here, but here's our new column for products. You know, like I said, we can use the term store picker tool here if a user wants to do that to find an appropriate value, or instead of doing that, which is a lot faster, is use the Ajax capabilities and start typing and pick a value. And like I said, you know, that's optimized to handle a high volume of entries in the term store. So it's a really nice, easy user experience there. And it really, you know, the whole goal of managed metadata, you know, is to make it pleasant and desirable to add metadata to content that you're adding to SharePoint, so that, you know, you get the benefits of having metadata throughout your SharePoint deployment. So we click save and we're done. So I think that's it as far as term sync goes. And like I say, we've designed it to be a simple product to configure and a kind of a set it and forget it type of product to run on a daily basis. And so with that, I think I'll turn it back over to Brett.
Okay, that's excellent. Thank you very much, Jeff. I think that totally shows the power of managed metadata and the external data sources. Certainly something that you're not going to be able to get elsewhere. So I think with that, we'll open up for any questions. So if anybody does have any questions on business connectivity services, the term sync, or also BCS MetaMan, both Jeff and I here will be able to answer those questions. Also, if you don't want to ask a question today, feel free to email either of us. You can get me on brett@lightningtools.com or on @BrettLonsdale is my Twitter handle. And Jeff, did you want to give you your contact again?
Jeff@premierpointsolutions.com or @JeffCate, C-A-T-E.
Okay, excellent. So if you want to ask a question now, if you just raise your hand using the GoToMeeting software, and I can unmute you and you can ask away. Okay, we have somebody raising their hand. This is Mickey Caney, so I'm going to unmute you, Mickey. Okay.
My question is that you can't use the BCS tool to put contents on document libraries, or can you put columns on document libraries?
Okay, so this is a question for BCS MetaMan?
No.
The term sync.
Not the term sync. No, not the term sync. The BCS part. Sorry.
Okay, so using SharePoint out of the box, you can create a external data column that allows you to pull in data into the document library. So yeah, you can go ahead and create an external data column, or you can use the term sync to make it a managed metadata column. So, so that is basically going to allow you to pull in the external data into the term store. So that means you can have subterms and so on. Users can look up from the term store, and that also allows you to add those columns into content types as well, so that they can be used multiple times in different lists or libraries, something that can't be done using the out-of-the-box external data column.
Okay, thank you.
All right, you're welcome. Okay, so any other questions? If you just raise your hand using the webinar software, and we can mute you. No, I think we're being let off lightly this time around. So, so if you do have any questions after today, yeah, please email us, brett@lightningtools.com or Jeff@premierpointsolutions.com, and we'll be happy to answer them. But otherwise, yeah, thank you very much for attending. I hope you found it useful. The webinar was recorded, so it will be made available later on via our usual sort of social channels and also on our website as well. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Brett.
Okay, thank you too.